morning, everyone. Beautiful morning down here in Green Valley. Before we start, I got to tell you a little story about Ole and Sven and Lars. Yeah, they were getting up in age, and they were sitting in the park bench, and Ole said, "Yeah, windy today." And Lars sitting next to him said, "No, it's Thursday." And Sven sitting on the end said, "So am I, let's go for a beer." You've been asking for it. Okay, again, welcome to the GVR Farm Club. Nice to see a good audience today. We're going to hear about U.S. military justice, which is different from civilian justice somewhat. We have Art here. He's going to go through it with us. He was in the Air Force for 21 years, I believe.
That's right. It only seemed like 252 months.
I was only in for 3 years, 11 months, and 3.5 weeks. Not that I was counting. I got out a week early. That's how it is. Anyhow, GVR Farm Club, we are doing this via Zoom again, but today, because he tends to wander around, all the Zoom people will see is the slideshow and hear his voice out there. I'm just telling you that. And I made sure to mute everyone 2 different ways. One, when I set up the meeting, and 2, when I started, it said mute everyone when they come off. All right. So we hope we won't have any interference out there. I was asked this morning also if last week's presentation is available to look at again. It's on Valley Fever, and it is. If you go to the website, gvrforumclub.com, and on the left-hand side, go down under recordings, you will see a link to it right there, so you can review it. The one we had prior, when Jay Noah was here, is not out there yet. I have some serious editing to do with that because of my fault. Anyhow, today, last thing, anyone that hasn't paid, GVR asks for an update on on our roster of members. So if you've not paid, $2 right back there. And we'll key it in, and we have over 240, I think, paid members so far, which is really, really good. But we'll pay more. We'll pay more. Okay, today, Bart is going to talk about U.S. military justice. Have you got your mic on?
Me. I do. All right. Well, thanks very much, Les. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks everybody for coming. I see a lot of old friends and a lot of people that I don't know too. Well, this is great that I guess everybody is an old friend. So the UCMJ Uniform Code of Military Justice is what drives the justice system, which is to say the prosecution, conviction, and sentencing of criminal acts in all of the branches of DOD, which are symbolized by these 4 symbols. I had a gentleman here remind me that the Coast Guard also uses the UCMJ for that same purpose, although the Coast Guard is not part of DOD. It used to be part of Department of Transportation, now it's Homeland Security.
I need to check one thing.
All right.
I'm not seeing you out there.
You said you
I said we were, yes.
were.
I said I was working.
Now there's no cover charge today, but there's a 2-drink minimum. I can keep that.
Yeah.
The Uniform Code of Military Justice, because of its name, people think that the uniform part of it means uniform services, but it doesn't. The Uniform Code is just a label that goes on various statutory schemes that are developed by, mostly by the American Law Institute, but by other legal organizations as well. And it's just propounded to whoever wants to adopt it as a uniform code of military justice. Most, if not all, National Guard units also adopt UCMJ as their justice code. So in between the justice slides, we've got really cool airplane slides. These obviously are the Thunderbirds. The aerobatic performance team, F-16s is what they fly, and that's what you see right there. My first base of assignment when I joined the Air Force in 1983 was Hill Air Force Base in Utah. And while the base itself is what's called Air Force Logistics Command Base, their primary lieutenant was an F-16 unit. I spent 4 years at that base, and there is almost nothing better to hear every day than an F-16 screaming over your head. Incidentally, as I think many of you know, but some of you don't, the Air Force tells you what the mission of the plane is with the letter designation in front of it. This is an F-16, so it's a fighter. So the Air Force itself has the command structure that is depicted here. The most important command unit in the Air Force, as in any military organization, is not at the top, it's at the bottom, because that's where things get done, including in the realm of military justice. So in the Air Force, we go from squadron to group to wing. Typically, a base will belong to a wing, and that wing commander is sometimes informally referred to as the mayor, if you will, of that base. Up to a numbered Air Force. Numbered Air Forces are headquarters types that administer these wings. Up to a major command. The major command that I started at, as I said, was Air Force Logistics Command. Later, I was assigned at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, which was an Air Combat Command base. Later still, I was assigned at Scott Air Force Base, which was a military airlift command. And then beyond that, of course, is HQ USAF. Those are the geeks and the Pentagon and such. Above that, I didn't include it because it's not part of the Air Force command structure, but above that, of course, is the Secretary of Defense, or a Secretary of the Air Force, which is part of HQ USAF, Secretary of Defense, and the President as Commander-in-Chief. Ooh, all right. This is the plane that's assigned not far from us, up at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson. It's the A-10, one of the coolest looking planes ever, in my opinion. And they're assigned, as far as I know, at least among the active duty force, only at Davis-Monthan. And it's an A-10. What's A? Attack. So the world of the Air Force and the world of is divided and stratified. And it's divided and stratified deliberately, not accidentally the way societies evolve, but the way the command structure decides to divide and stratify. These are the enlisted grades in the Air Force from E1 to E9. Airman basic is what our folks start out at in basic training, and if they get promoted all the way to the top in the enlisted force structure, they're Chief Master Sergeants. The ranks from E5 through E9, you'll notice they all include the word sergeant, and those are called NCOs, or non-commissioned officers. The enlisted structure is fundamentally different from the officer structure in one primary way, I would say. And that is that enlisted people serve for terms of enlistment. And it's a specified number of years, typically 4 or 6 these days, I believe, as it was when I was on active duty as well. And at the end of that enlistment, their obligation to, it's a contractual obligation, and their obligation to the Air Force concludes. And if they choose to go their own way thereafter, that's it. They just do not apply for re-enlistment and are discharged, and away they go. For the SR-71 Blackbird, maybe the coolest looking plane ever. There's one on static display up at the Pima County Air Museum. Very, 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 very interesting. So SR, what's SR? Surveillance and reconnaissance. Surveillance and reconnaissance. Now we talked briefly about enlisted. We'll come back to that. But on the officer side, these are the ranks that officers have. Start on the second lieutenant, or butter bars, as they're sometimes called. They have yellow single balls. All the way through 4-star general. Those first 3 ranks, lieutenant and captain, are called company grade officers. The next 3 ranks are called field grade officers, and then obviously everybody with general is either a flag grade or a general officer. Every enlisted person on every base, everywhere, regardless of that enlisted person's rank, even if he or she is a chief master sergeant, must address every officer, even if that officer is a lowly butterfly, as sir or ma'am. That is the deliberate stratification of not just the American military, but every military organization for thousands of years, as between the enlisted personnel and the officer personnel. Enlisted people are not permitted to betray any disrespect for officers. That's not to say that they can't disrespect officers. They cannot, but they cannot overtly betray that disrespect. That's a criminal offense under the UCMJ, as we'll see later. For somebody like me, my parents are both from South Carolina, and I was raised partially in South Carolina, and then the rest of the time in Toledo, Ohio. But my parents never stopped being pretty much sort of unreconstructed Southerners. So going into the Air Force was in many ways easy for me, because I already addressed every adult I encountered for as long as I was being raised by that pair of parents I had, as sir or ma'am. But for people who aren't used to that, it's quite a change. Oops. Ooh, the F-15E. And if you can see on the markings on the tail, it's SJ. That's Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, home of the 4th Fighter, which is where I was assigned as what's called the base staff executive. That's the guy who runs the legal office, guy or gal. It's the legal office. And those are what flew out of Seymour Johnson when I was there. And I believe they still fly out. Wonderful, 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 wonderful planes. I said that hearing the F-16 screaming over your head was almost the best sound in the Air Force. I think probably the best sound in the Air Force was hearing F-15s scream over your head. And of course it's F, so it's another fighter. The Uniform Code of Military Justice is a part of this. This is the MCM, or the Manual for Courts Martial. For people, for JAGs who are on active duty, who are performing military justice functions, And that's, you can be a prosecutor, you can be a defense counsel, you can be a judge. Those are all active duty roles in the military justice system. This is sort of your Bible. It's constantly with you. You're constantly flipping through it to see how it applies to particular cases at particular times. This was the last MCM that I got. If you're an active duty JAG, you get the new editions every time they come out. This is the 2002 edition. I was on active duty from 1983 until 2004. So that's the last one before I retired. Since then, there have been, I think, 5 or 6. And there's a 2020 edition of the MCM. Obviously, I don't get those anymore because I don't need them. I don't do any of this stuff. But within the MCM are interesting things. If you're practicing in that area, there are the rules for court-martial, or RCMs, which are the procedural rules telling you how a case gets from the factual commission of an offense to a court-martial or some other disposition. There are the military rules of evidence, or MREs, not to be confused with meals ready to eat. These are different MREs. The military rules of evidence are virtually identical to the federal rules of evidence, which is what you mostly learn in law school anyway. So there's nothing new there. There's the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is the actual statute, the statutory language, followed by some necessary explanation for it. And then following that is some commentary from various sources, often it's generated by case law, on how these things fit together and how the Uniform Code of Military Justice should be interpreted. The Uniform Code of Military Justice was adopted in '51. It replaced the old Articles of War, and the Articles of it retained that portion of language. Everything in here is an article. As you'll see shortly, every criminal section has its own article number. And the key difference between jurisdiction under the UCMJ and jurisdiction under any other criminal code is this. It is dependent strictly on the status of the defendant. The UCMJ doesn't care where an offense was committed, which is very, very different from a state criminal code, which is where 99% plus of criminal prosecutions in the United States take place. State criminal codes are very much focused on the borders of that state. If crime was committed within those borders, then those state courts have jurisdiction. If it wasn't, they don't. That's part of the reason, incidentally, I would even say the primary reason, that has historically been kind of difficult to prosecute serial killers who move around a lot. Particularly, I mean, I don't mean to tar all truck drivers with this brush, but there have been a number of notable serial killers who are truck drivers, and it's really tough to prosecute them. Even after you find the body, and even after you're pretty sure who did the crime, it's very difficult to pin down. You know, did it happen in Pennsylvania? You know, this is a victim from Pennsylvania. The body is found in Kansas. You know, did it happen in Pennsylvania, or Ohio, Indiana, or Illinois, well, the UCMJ doesn't care about that. No matter where you commit an offense, if you're subject to the UCMJ, you can be prosecuted. Who's subject to the UCMJ? Anybody who's on active duty at any given moment. That is the vast majority of people subject to the UCMJ. However, there are some people who are technically subject to the UCMJ in addition to that, although it's very rare that you see prosecutions of them. I'm one of them. I'm a retiree. Retirees are technically still subject to the UCMJ. I say technically, again, almost never. The last case that I can remember seeing prosecuted of a retiree was either from the late 70s or the early 80s. And it was a guy who was using his retired status for the commission of various criminal offenses in the black market somewhere in Southeast Asia. And you really got to climb the ladder. That's a service secretary decision as to whether you're going to try to assert jurisdiction over a retiree. And as I say, hardly ever happens. Other people that are still subject to UCMJ, people who have had a punitive discharge adjudged in a court-martial and are awaiting appellate review and finalization of that discharge are technically still subject to the UCMJ. Now, those who are confined during that period, it's real easy to prosecute them. They're right in front of you. But if you're not in confinement, but you're still on appellate review, I mean, these are people who are out in the civilian world. And every once in a while, very rarely, you'll hear about somebody on appellate leave being court-martialed again for some additional misconduct. Incidentally, as I'm going along, if questions occur to you, I will endeavor to ask them, although chances are the answer might come out in a later slide. Now, what I'm going to do is kind of try to zip through these slides, and then at the end of that, if there are questions, I'm happy to do it for as long as Les doesn't boot me out. 10 o'clock, there you go. All right, kind of a boring plane. The KC-135. Now, KC, what's that? C is cargo, so that's easy. The K is a little murkier actually in history, but KCs are the planes that refuel other planes. So they're, in Air Force parlance, they're called gas passers. And the origin of that K for gas passers, as I say, is a little murky, but it's probably kerosene, because jet fuel chemically is essentially kerosene. There were KC-135s that belonged to a reserve unit at a base that I was assigned at, Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. There's no way to make them look cool, sitting on the tarmac, they don't. Up in the air, they don't. Sorry. Okay, here we go. The UCMJ, like all military codes, has your classic common law crimes, and we'll see a slide. But the classic rape, murder, assault, etc. Those are all there. Plus military-specific crimes, things like misbehavior before the enemy, hazarding a vessel, all sorts of other cool ones. And it has a statute of limitations, like most criminal codes in the civilian world. For most offenses under the UCMJ, the statute of limitations is 5 years. And that's for court-martial purposes. For non-judicial punishment, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes, the statute of limitations is 2 years. For some offenses, there's no statute of limitation. And those are pretty much track the civilian world. Rape and murder, most civilian criminal codes don't have a statute of limitations for those offenses. And I believe for treason and similar offenses under the UCMJ, there's no statute of limitations. Oh, the Flying Wing flies out of, I believe the only base that flies it is Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. B, bomber. Really cool looking. Operationally has not proven so far to be all that valuable. But, the Germans had a Flying Wing during World War II, also a really cool looking plane, depicted being burned up by Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark. So in responding to misconduct, the Air Force has two options. More accurately, command has two options. Military justice is a command function. On the punitive side are actions under the UCMJ. Everything else is administrative. Every other response, if it's not under the UCMJ, is an administrative response to misconduct. And there are letters of admonishment, letters of reprimand, creation of what's called an unfavorable information file, or UIF, which you plug adverse information about a person. But again, very often you will hear that so-and-so was punished by a letter of reprimand, or so-and-so was punished by a change of assignment, or so-and-so was punished by relief from some command position. I understand the tendency of people to describe that as punishment, but it's not really punishment. It's just an administrative response to misconduct. Ooh, the C-130, the C-130C for, and it is the last plane of a particular type that the Air Force still has in its inventory. What type? That's a great answer if you go backwards. Not to my knowledge, but it's, somebody said it. Yeah, it's propeller driven. Super, super cool planes, very versatile. I don't think they're going away anytime soon. So the common law crimes, and I'll just, they're kind of typical. Article 111, driving under the influence, use of illegal drugs, murder, manslaughter, rape, larceny, robbery, forgery, sodomy, arson, extortion, assault, burglary, perjury. I mean, that's a laundry list of crimes that has been around in the English-speaking world for, well over 1,000 years. And they're all in the UCMJ as well. There are a number of common law crimes that are also spelled out in the general article. The general article is Article 134. If some guy does something that you're just sure is prejudicial to good order or discipline, but you can't find a way to fit it into any of the specific articles, that means it's an Article 134 offense, and that's how you charge it. Oh, the P-38, the twin fuselage beauty. P for, I included this because we don't have any P's at present in the Air Force inventory. Pursuit, exactly right. Now, here's a little bit of aviation trivia for you. The SR-71, which I think is the prettiest plane ever, and the P-38 were both designed by the same guy. Does anybody know who that guy was? Kelly Johnson, exactly right. A guy who was designing planes from about age 12. And that's literally true, by the way, it's not an exaggeration. Now, in addition to the common law crimes, we have the military specific crimes. Article 83, fraudulent enlistment, desertion, absence without leave. 86, you may, in the old days, he did an 86, and that means he left without leave. You'll note that Agent Maxwell Smart, Get Smart, was Agent 86 too, implying that he was somewhat cowardly. Anyway, Article 87, missing a movement. This has nothing to do with an Air Force member's digestion. Missing a movement is when a unit or a squadron or some identifiable group of military people are assigned to, in the Air Force, it's usually get on a plane to go someplace for, an exercise or whatever. And if you're not there to get on the plane or the bus or whatever, then you have missed a movement. Article 89, disrespect to a superior NCO. Obviously, that's an enlisted only offense, right? Because there's no such thing as a superior NCO for any officer. Assaulting or disobeying an officer, failure of regulation, mutiny and sedition, misbehavior before the enemy, aiding the enemy, misconduct as a POW. I love this progression. This is like, I can easily imagine one guy doing all of these in the course of a few months. Malingering, that's pretending to be unable to perform duties when really you can't. Conduct unbecoming an officer, something that I, worried about now and again. And then Article 134. Article 134 is the catch-all provision, both for military offenses and for common law crimes. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what the general article covers, it starts with one of my favorites. It's an alphabetical list, but my favorite is abusing a public animal. Obviously came out of a time when the Army primarily had a lot of mules and horses, but I am very pleased to report to you that I actually prosecuted a case for abusing a public animal. And I bet, what was the public animal? Anybody want to guess? Who said it? Yeah, it was a drug dog. The security forces guys on base had a drug dog, and one of the base cops, staff sergeant, got really angry at this dog one day, and he kicked it. And unfortunately, the dog died from injuries suffered in that kick. He felt terrible, by the way. He was tremendously remorseful, but he was also punished under Article 15. Other offenses: indecent assault, bigamy. I never represented anybody charged with bigamy, and I always regretted it because I wanted to get to sentencing, because then I could say, Your Honor, my client has been convicted of having 2 wives. Hasn't he been punished enough? But I never got that opportunity. Bribery, bounce checks, wrongful cohabitation. That's people pretending to be married when they're not really married. Dishonorable failure to pay a debt. Civilian criminal codes do not criminalize people who don't pay their debts, but the UCMJ does. Disorderly conduct, drinking liquor with a prisoner. There was one Article 15 for that many years ago. Incapacitation for duty as a result of drunkenness. Discharging a firearm through negligence. Fleeing a scene of an accident. Indecent acts or liberties with a child. These are indecent acts that don't rise to the level of sodomy or rape under the specific articles. Negligent homicide. Etc. You get the idea, but you're not bound by this list. Again, if there's conduct that is clearly prejudicial to good order and discipline, but it's not described by any of the multitude of little subsections in the UCMJ, you can create your own. All right, the U2. This is the only planet that I'm aware of in the history of the Air Force that had a designation U. Any guesses? Very good. Utility is correct. The U2 was interesting in that it was really developed by the CIA, not by the Air Force. And the CIA, as part of its cover for this plane, labeled it the U2. Oh, this is just a utility plane. Of course, this is a plane whose only utility is flying at high altitudes and taking photographs downward. Who's the most famous pilot of a U2 ever? Yes, Gary Powers. And my last trivia, well, Davis-Monthan flew U-2s in the mid-70s just for a couple of years. And they have a U-2 on static display at Davis-Monthan. And my last question, who designed the U-2? Kelly Johnson is correct. All right, so if you're going to take punitive action against somebody, that means it's under the UCMJ, and that means it fits into one of these 4 categories. Non-judicial punishment, that is by far the biggest biggest category of punitive actions taken under the UCMJ. It's taken under Article 15 of the UCMJ, and therefore they're commonly called Article 15s. You got an Article 15 for drunk driving. You got an Article 15 for getting into a fight or whatever. In the Navy, I believe they're called captain's mats. Because the Navy is weird. But everywhere else, they're called Article 15s. Now, the punishments under Article 15 are determined by the rank of the person punishing the punishment compared with the rank of the person getting the punishment. But in no instance can they exceed reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and something called correctional custody if there are facilities available for it. Correctional custody is sort of like it's halfway between being free and being jail. But you can't put anybody in prison under an Article 15. And you can't impose any kind of punitive discharge under an Article 15. For that reason, Article 15 is said to be a rehabilitative tool more than it is a tool to wipe somebody out of the Air Force. If you're a first-term airman or even junior NCO, it's possible to survive Article 15 and have a successful career thereafter. And believe me, there are plenty of guys and gals who have completed military careers who had Article 15s early on. But I mean, once you get it past probably staff sergeant or tech sergeant, and certainly for an officer, pretty much at any grade, an Article 15 is a career ender. A summary court-martial. Summary court-martial, I have to list it because it's in the UCMJ. In a summary court-martial, a single officer appointed by the appropriate level of command, typically it's the Special Court-Martial Convening Authority, which is typically the wing commander or base mayor, does everything. He or she listens to the evidence, assesses guilt or innocence, and then imposes a penalty. The penalties are pretty much the same as an Article 15, except that a summary court-martial can impose up to 30 days jail. Jail and correctional custody are 2 different things. So that's the last I'll mention summary court-martials, because there's no tradition of it in the Air Force. I think I can remember once when I was on active duty, hearing that somebody somewhere, some other base, was going to do a summary court-martial. And it was, it's like a surgeon hearing that some impossible operation. Really? They're doing that? They're going to do a summary court-martial over there? What did this guy do? But never happens in the Air Force. The workhorse of the Air Force judicial system, and I believe the other services judicial system as well, is the special court-martial. The special court-martial is intended to address serious misdemeanor or minor felony offenses. The maximum penalty, 6 months jail, reduction in grade all the way down to the lowest enlisted rank, forfeitures of pay, and most importantly, from the standpoint of military justice, a bad conduct discharge. There are 3 kinds of punitive discharges. There's a bad conduct discharge. A bad conduct discharge can be imposed by a special court-martial or by a general court-martial. That's it. There is a dishonorable, BCD incidentally is sometimes called a big chicken dinner. Did he get a big chicken dinner? Yes, he got a big chicken dinner. A dishonorable discharge can be imposed only, we'll get to it in a minute, but it can be imposed only by a general court-martial. And for officers, those discharges, bad conduct discharge and dishonorable discharge, are for enlisted personnel. For officers, there's only one kind of punitive discharge, and it's called a dismissal. And the dismissal can be adjudged only by a general court martial. So we'll go on to general court martial. Felonies, general court martial, sky's the limit. We can do life in prison, we can do execution, we can do a bad kind of discharge, we can do a dishonorable discharge. If it's an officer, a dismissal can be imposed. Now, in order to authorize the death penalty is, as it should be, a cumbersome procedure. And you have to go clear up to the Secretary of the Air Force before you can get permission to pursue execution as a punishment in a general court martial. In the time that I was in the Air Force, which was 21 years, I was a defense counsel for 4 of those years. I was first an area defense counsel. An area defense counsel is the guy or gal at a base who represents people who are facing adverse action. It includes both punitive action and adverse administrative action. But the person who takes the side of the person who's being accused of some deficiency in their conduct is the area defense counsel. I was an area defense counsel at Hill Air Force Base in Utah for 1 year. And then I was transferred to Rhein-Main Air Base in Germany, which is no longer with us. But there I was what's called a circuit defense counsel. The Air Force divides its bases into circuits. And the European circuit at that time was called the 6th Circuit. And so I traveled all over Europe representing people who were being court-martialed. Because I was a circuit defense counsel, I really didn't get involved in Article 15s or even very often in a special court-martial. I typically got sent to where somebody was facing a general court-martial. For about just over a year of those 3 years, almost all the cases I did were child sex offenders. Very, very difficult cases because you can't explain to a jury why somebody commits that offense. Now, drug cases, you can explain that pretty well. This guy was feeling depressed or under the weather or sad, and the drugs helped him feel better. You know, larceny cases, super easy to defend. Well, this guy wanted something for nothing. But child sex cases, very, very different. I will say that in the whole time that I was on the Air Force, I was personally involved with only one case in which I thought that the person who was prosecuted and convicted and went to jail really suffered an injustice in his life, and it was a child sex abuse case. However, the injustice was not undertaken by the Air Force. I thought everything the Air Force did was right, but by a different entity back in the States. I'm not going to talk any more about it than that in this group, but if you want to know about that particular case, I'll be happy to let you know. In these you know, F-22, obviously it's a fighter, cool looking. You know, I like the older stuff. But. So, ways to leave the Air Force. By far the most lucrative way to leave the Air Force is to die. Because then your beneficiary gets your serviceman's group life insurance, SGLI, which you're signed up for automatically, unless you explicitly reject it. It's crazy to explicitly reject it. It's super cheap. I think it's up to $500,000 now. When I was on active duty, it was $100,000. Or if if you're not savvy enough to die, then you can be administratively discharged. An honorable discharge is sometimes called the military's gold watch. You know, there's nothing better to get than an honorable discharge. That's what I got when I retired in 2004. Second best, but still under honorable conditions, is called a general discharge. And a general discharge goes to people typically who have engaged in either a pattern of misconduct, a minor misconduct, or they have really not performed their duties very well, in which case they might be processed for discharge before the termination of their enlistment and get a general discharge. If you make it to the end of your enlistment, you get an honorable. Then there is the worst kind of administrative discharge you can get under other than honorable conditions, or UOTHC. That is for people who are, essentially it's for people who just barely managed to avoid getting a punitive discharge. And when you're pursuing a trial, when you go to trial in the Air Force, just like in all civilian jurisdictions, if you're representing the defendant, you can pursue a plea bargain. We don't call them plea bargains in the military. We call them pretrial agreements, or PTAs. So, and it's, you know, okay, if we plead guilty to this, you drop that, and you agree that you're not going to have a sentence in excess of X, then we'll do it. But if you request discharge in lieu of trial by court martial, which is different from a PTA. A PTA means you're going to have the trial and there's going to be a sentence. But with a request for discharge in lieu of trial by court martial, the kind of discharge that somebody gets with that is an under other than honorable conditions discharge, or UOTHC. And that was sort of, to some extent, that was kind of my specialty in pursuing the cases that I pursued. And that was to convince the prosecution that it was going to be such a royal pain in the neck to go through this trial. It made more sense just to discharge this guy and be done with it. And there's another kind, as an entry-level separation, or ELS. That is, somebody's been on active duty less than 180 days. And that's essentially telling the world, we don't know if this person is good, bad, or indifferent. We just haven't had them around long enough to tell. Punitive discharges I've discussed. In court martials, the members are instructed that imposing a punitive discharge deprives the person receiving it of most veterans' benefits. That's correct. They're also advised that it seriously impairs their ability to obtain civilian employment. I don't think that's correct for the vast majority of civilian employment. It would certainly impair your ability to obtain federal employment. But everybody else, at least in my years, which are a lot of years, around, most employers don't seem to care what kind of discharge somebody has got, in part because they don't really know what it means. Yay, the B-52, another bomber, wonderfully depicted in one of the best movies of all time, Dr. Strangelove. The trial. The special court martial is convened by the special court martial convening authority, typically the wing commander. It can be before members or by judge alone. Members is what we call the jury. If it's members, the final panel must be at least 3 members. The members will be officers subordinate to the wing commander, selected by the wing commander for that service. The defendant, if he wishes, can require, I say he, obviously, both male and female defendants, but believe me, they're mostly guys, can request enlisted representation on that panel. And if such a request is made, at least 1/3 of the final panel must be enlisted persons. Hardly ever. I can remember one case that I was aware of in 21 years. I remember one case where the defendant requested enlisted representation. Why is that? Well, here's what happens. The special court martial convening authority, when he picks a panel for a special court, will probably pick 5 or 6 people. There'll be a lieutenant colonel, a major or 2, a captain or 2, and a couple of lieutenants. That's the panel that you start with. If you request enlisted representation, guess what? The lieutenants drop off that panel. And instead, you get some crusty old senior master sergeant or chief master sergeant replacing the lieutenants. And all of my clients correctly concluded that that was probably a bad idea, so they didn't do that. A 2/3 vote is required to convict. In some civilian jurisdictions, it has to be a unanimous vote, although that number is shrinking year by year. But in the military, it's still 2/3. And the last line, I cringed when I typed it. The military judge decides the sentence. This is a significant departure from the way that the UCMJ has operated forever. It used to be that the members who decided guilt or innocence, also decided what the sentence was going to be, and also had to vote 2/3 on that sentence. Well, you know, the Defense Appropriation Act of 2022, either 2021 or 2022, changes that. A very significant change to the UCMJ. And, you know, starting essentially, I think it went into effect in January of this year, or maybe it's January of last year. But anyway, now it's the judge alone. I don't like that at all. The maintenance of good order and discipline is a function of command. It is not a function of lawyers. And believe me, in the Air Force, which is run by fighter pilots, lawyers are always on the outside. Look, old joke, what's the difference between God and a fighter pilot? God does not believe he's a fighter pilot. And then this system should not be run by lawyers. It ought to be run by commanders, in my opinion. But there's so many lawyers. You know, when I was on active duty, there were like 1,400 lawyers. In the Air Force, 1,400 lawyers. I mean, even as one of them, I thought that was a crazy number. But it's just symptomatic of the world that we live in which lawyers run everything. T-37, cute little trainer. Well, I've given it away. What does T stand for? Trainer. The General Court Martial. The General Court Martial is convened by the GCM convening authority, as you might expect. Usually that's the numbered Air Force commander. Numbered Air Force commander is usually either a 2-star, sometimes a 3-star, but usually a 2-star. The wing commander that I mentioned earlier is usually a brigadier general, sometimes a full colonel who's, you know, on his way to being a brigadier general. A general court martial has to be preceded by a hearing called an Article 32 hearing, because that's the part of the UCMJ that describes it. It's a classic preliminary hearing. At an Article 32 hearing, the prosecution has to establish 2 things: probable cause to believe that a crime was committed and that the accused committed it. It's just like a preliminary hearing in every jurisdiction in America, I think, except maybe Louisiana, because Louisiana is weird. But that Article 32 hearing is an officer, typically it's a JAG officer. I was at Article 32 hearing several times at bases that were distant from the base where I was assigned. The most interesting one was an Article 32 hearing for a doctor. He was a major who got tagged for a random urinalysis. And he went to the bathroom shortly before showing up for to submit his sample. And the person collecting the sample noticed 2 things. It was exceptionally clear and it was cool. And obviously, although he never admitted it, obviously what this guy had done was catheterize himself prior to the submitting the sample and put a bunch of tap water. Later analysis established it had chlorine in it too, but had put tap water in his bladder, and that's what he feed into the cup. Okay. General court martial, trial by members or judge alone, again, it has to be at least 5. Same rules, 2/3 vote. Same rules as to enlisted representation if that's what you want. And again, because of this recent change under the Defense Appropriations Act, the military judge is the one who's going to decide the sentence. I should mention that military judges and defense counsels and trial counsels, which is what the Air Force calls prosecutors, are in a separate supervisory chain under the judge advocate general. The judge advocate general being the guy or gal, so far it's all been guys, who decide, who run the JAG department. When I was on active duty, it was a department. Now it's a corps. Used to be a corps, then it was a department. Now it's a corps again. I liked department. There's an unusual plane, F-111, obviously a fighter, sometimes called the FB-111 because it was a fighter bomber. And it had a design feature that was very odd. What was it? Exactly, it was a swing wing plane. Arguably the only benefit that the F-111 delivered for the United States Air Force was that it forced the Soviets to waste their money on a swing wing fighter. Appellate review, all trials are transcribed. This is absolutely a huge departure from civilian practice. When you watch somebody getting tried of a criminal offense in a civilian court, a tiny percentage of those records get transcribed for appellate review. In the Air Force, they're all transcribed. Some of them are summary. If the sentence does not include a punitive discharge or does not include confinement for more than a year, then a summary transcript is prepared. But if it is a BCD or a dishonorable discharge or dismissal or confinement for a year or more, then it's word for word. All sentences, including a punitive discharge, confinement of a year, have to be reviewed by the Air Force Court of Military Review. The Air Force Court of Military Review is made up of active duty JAGs, typically lieutenant colonels and colonels, sometimes a major get thrown in there, who sit in panels of 3 to hear cases. The appeal can go from the Air Force Court of Military Review to the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, and that can also then be appealed to the Supreme Court. And in any case, at any time, the president, as commander-in-chief, may exercise clemency. Please note that these levels of command, the wing commander, when he gets, if he has convened a special court-martial and the sentence is X, that wing commander can approve any sentence up to X. He can approve any sentence below X, but he can't approve any sentence above X. In other words, when you conduct a trial, you have at that moment, as the trial concludes, you've set a seal on what can happen to that defendant. Nothing worse than the adjudged sentence, whatever it is, can actually be imposed on. There are all sorts of ways that clemency gets plugged in. There's a special assistant, the Judge Advocate General of the Air Force, and I believe all the services have the same assistant. And he is the last time I knew him, I don't know who it is now. He or she is constantly whispering in the Judge Advocate General's ear, hey, we should go easy on this guy. That's his job. There are also multiple entities within DOD that have the authority to upgrade discharges. The most obvious one, and the one that you'll hear the most about if you hear anything about it, is called the BCMR, Board for Correction of Military Records. That has the authority to change a punitive discharge to some other kind of, presumably, administrative discharge. There are, and those are just 2 of the entities. There are several others. There are always ways for people who have gotten a punitive discharge to prove to the government that they've lived a good life after that, and therefore that punitive discharge should be erased. All right, the F-4, the plane that my brother was a backseater in, he was a weapons systems officer, or WISO, or GIB, that's guy in back, in F-4s. C-17, yeah, cargo planes, what can you say? The F-35, the most recent addition to the Air Force fleet, serious operational maintenance problems, a typical ready rate of less than 50%. What is the nickname of the F-35 among pilots? I am told these days on active duty in the Air Force, the Penguin. Need I say more? C-5, super cool plane, even though it's a cargo plane. Flew to and from Europe a couple of times in the top passenger portion of the C-5. Great fun. All right, that's me. That's my email address. If you have, I'm sorry, we're at 10 o'clock. If you have any questions that you would like to ask me, I will hang around after this. If you want to ask me then, that's great. Or if you want to email me with them, I'm happy to answer them to the extent I can. Often my answers will be, I have no idea. But I will do my best. Thanks very much. It's great.
Let's take one or two questions. Anybody have a question? I know it's kind of awkward.
Gary Powers charged for something that.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, because Gary Powers charged with something once he was returned to the United States. That's not that I'm aware of. Obviously, he's one of the unluckies. There was, but the interesting question about Gary Powers, and I haven't read enough to answer for sure, but I think I have an answer. Was Gary Powers more an Air Force major or a CIA agent? I think the answer is he was probably more of a CIA agent, and his cover was being an Air Force major.
One more.
I have two though. Where does a medical discharge fall and how long take a trial to wind?
Medical discharges, I wasn't all that familiar with because they weren't part of the justice system. But typically I think they're honorable discharges. And number two, how long does it take for appellate review? It used to be, back when I was there, it could take between 6 and 12 months to get a review out of the Air Force Court of Military Review of a sentence that was included a punitive discharge or a year or more confinement. Today, I think that number is down. I think typically it is less than 6 months.
One more. Order.
If a service member is arrested by civilian authorities, are they tried in the military system or are they tried in the civilian system?
Great question, and unfortunately, it's kind of a can of worms. It depends on the jurisdictional status of where he's at, particularly overseas. Usually, overseas is where that question comes up, and it is driven by something called a SOFA, or Status of Forces Agreement. And if the status of forces agreements that we've got with people we beat, that means when I was there, chiefly Germany and Italy, then we hold all the cards and the military decides how that person is going to be dealt with. If it happens in a country that was allied with us, and you can argue with that, say Italy was really allied with us towards the end. No, we beat them. But if it was allied with us, like Great Britain or Holland or France, etc., then typically we being the Air Force, have to negotiate with that government as to who will prosecute them.
But that really, let's say, for example, a serviceman gets off on,
Can we hold that? Can we hold your? I'll answer your question in a moment. I did want to mention the one and only murderer that I represented while I was on active duty. It was a guy who killed his wife, as most murderers do. Killed his wife in Utrecht, the Netherlands, and he was assigned at Soesterberg Air Force Base, or Soesterberg Air Base, more accurately, which was just outside Utrecht. Anyway, because Holland was one of our allies and was not one of the countries that we beat, we had to negotiate. I say we, the Air Force, I was actually defense counsel, but had to negotiate as to get jurisdiction. And the Dutch government said no. The Dutch government would not release jurisdiction over this guy, who's an NCO, staff sergeant, and actually prosecuted him itself, the Dutch government, for that murder. And it was, it was a pretty egregious, clearly planned to some extent murder. His sentence from the Dutch court was 6 years. Which, well, anyway. I should tell you that he, in his lengthy confession that he made to the Dutch authorities, he said the reason he had killed her was that she had nagged him for his smoking. So when I visited him in the Dutch jail, for the first and only time in my time in Europe, I used my coupon at the commissary to buy a carton of cigarettes. I found out from his coworkers what his cigarettes were, and I took him that carton of cigarettes when I visited. And I told him right up front, I said, you know, some people object to other people smoking, but I'm not one of those people. So I want you to feel free to smoke all you want. But anyway, so he went to Dutch jail. He was there for 3 years. And then one night, literally in the middle of the night, the Dutch authorities turned him back over to the Air Force, kind of slipped him under the door and said, okay, he's yours now. The Dutch government was waiting for the political furor over this to die down. The Dutch people were very opposed to capital punishment. And anyway, so he was then prosecuted, court-martialed, sentenced to 30 years by court-martial. You're going to say, isn't that double jeopardy? No, it isn't. Two separate sovereigns. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you all next year.